And it's a programme that builds on some pioneering work by UTAS geographers on the role of insurance in climate change adaptation that goes back to 2010. So insurance is a really remarkably under-researched topic. It's generally considered a benign tool to help people rebuild and recover after a disaster. But Dr. Booth's work is the first to address what this actually means for people who live in high-risk areas of Australia. And this work is of international relevance as the global impact of climatic disasters continues to rise. While there's some other independent research which mostly uses quantitative methods to examine households' willingness to pay for insurance, for that kind of thing, Dr. Booth is one of a handful of researchers worldwide who have applied qualitative methods to investigate the lived experience of insurance decision making. And that's particularly relevant to those of us who live in bushfire risk areas. So unfortunately, Kate has a really bad cold today, and I've dragged her along, so she's almost lost her voice. So I will be stepping in occasionally if she runs out of steam.
Yeah, so as soon as my voice stops completely, it's over to Chloe.
Yes, forgive us if it's a little bit of a wonky presentation for that reason.
Yeah.
But anyway, please join me in welcoming Kate.
Thanks. So I will mention that Chloe is one of the researchers on the insurance project, so she's more than capable of stepping in when, if I conk out completely. Can I get a sense of who's in the room? Who's academic? Who's from the university? Yeah. Community groups or residents with an interest? Yeah. Government? Insurance. I think the suits are a giveaway, actually. Okay, great. So a nice, diverse group of people here, which is fantastic. Okay, so a burning question, what to do about under-insurance. Under-insurance as a issue, as a topic, has only recently begun to gain prominence in relation to government and community discourses or narratives and initiatives. I guess it's fair to assume that ever since insurance started or began or evolved, that the issue of underinsurance, either not having enough insurance or not having insurance at all, was always a problem or an issue. But I think through the process of insurance becoming normalised within society, in Western cultures now, it's now completely normal to have insurance of one kind or another. So the idea of some people not having insurance or having insurance and not having enough coverage if something should happen has emerged in part because of that normalisation. So we're going to talk about this in the context of bushfires, very topical this summer in Australia, including Tasmania, though fortunately the loss of property this summer, touch wood, has been fairly minimal, though of course there are individuals and families struggling. There are people struggling in that context as we speak. Okay, so this is our Australian Research Council project. That's the main project we're working on. When Disaster Strikes, Geographies of House and Contents Under Insurance. It's myself, Professor Bruce Tranter from UTAS, Dr. Christine Erickson from the University of Wollongong, Associate Professor Sean French from the University of Nottingham in the UK, Dr. Chloe Lucas, Dr. Eliza DeVette from Wollongong, and Travis Young, who's a PhD candidate up the back from Pennsylvania State University. So that's the main funding for the research that I'm talking about today. But Chloe has also initiated another spin-off project called After the Flood. So in response to the flooding that happened in Hobart in May last year, Chloe is leading pilot research based on 2 UTAS internal research grants. So we'll draw on findings from both those projects as we go through this afternoon. There's a broader shift in society particularly from neoliberal inclined governments, towards the privatisation of risk, which is basically encouraging people, households, businesses to take more responsibility for their own risk. And insurance is seen as key here, because private individuals, private businesses can buy insurance and in theory manage their own risk in that way. So sometimes insurance is presented in documents as if it's a standalone solution to recovery following disaster or emergency events. But as I'm sure you're all familiar with, there's a whole context within which insurance operates, irrespective of those aspirations for the privatisation of risk and the moving of responsibility and costs away from government. So there's building codes, there's land use planning, fuel reduction perhaps, data collection and information sharing, community education, firefighting, post-disaster government and non-government supported recovery. And that's just, that's skating over a lot of things. There's other things that aren't mentioned there. I mean, there's also the bigger global context within which house and contents insurance operates, and that relates to global financial processes and systems, including reinsurers that back up insurers like the RACT and other more localised insurance companies. So some figures on underinsurance. If you want to shock people and get people's attention, some of the underinsurance figures can appear quite alarming. Three sets of data here, not comparable, but they do illustrate some of the figures that you'll find in non-government literature, insurance company reports, as well as academic research. So the top one is a report from Lloyd's. It's the Lloyd's Underinsurance report for the whole planet, or a selection of countries around the globe. So they've calculated uninsured loss per natural disaster between 2004 and 2011 at 0.8 billion in the United Kingdom and 18.91 billion in China. This is actually in US dollars, because I forgot to change it before I came up here. So that equates to almost 100% uninsured losses in China. Culturally, insurance has evolved within the Western context. So non-Western nations are less likely to have insurance. So the second group of figures is from research that I've undertaken with Bruce Tranter as part of these projects. We did a national survey with a representative sample, and we found that approximately 9% of homeowners don't have house insurance, and 41% of renters are without contents insurance. Now, we actually think the figure of 9% might be a little bit higher, because when we've done qualitative interviews with people who live in high bushfire risk areas, people that have chosen not to have home insurance, they express a high degree of scepticism and mistrust, not only in insurance companies, but in academics and other formal institutions. It's actually really hard to find people to interview that don't have insurance. There can be political reasons, as I've said, for that distrust in institutions, but also there's, depending on the reasons behind not having insurance, there can be a sense of embarrassment or shame because of the stigma. Because of the normalisation of insurance, there's a certain stigma attached to being, to not having insurance. So the third set of figures comes from Legal Aid New South Wales following the Blue Mountains bushfires in 2013. This was a survey of people who had lost their properties. 82% of households discovered after the disaster they were underinsured, as in they had insurance coverage, that before their disaster they assumed would cover them. Now, this amounted to up to $500,000 of underinsurance for the houses, the buildings, and up to $200,000 underinsurance for contents. Now, this is very context-specific, these figures, because after a disaster, a number of things happen, including competition with builders, so rebuild prices escalate, and also rebuilding a house to BAL standards, to the building code standards, is often more expensive than people assumed. So possible explanations, I've already skirted over some of these, for why people are not insured at all or are inadequately covered. Issues of affordability. Some people are irrational and foolish individuals. They're not making rational decisions. They're not sourcing the right information on risks and insurance. And as a consequence, they're either not insured or they're underinsured. Another possible explanation is a lack of risk information. So people don't know where to find out what kind of risks might be posed to the place where they live. Or even they mightn't have the information on what types of insurance coverage to purchase or what their insurance coverage actually covers. Another possible explanation is insurance uptake not keeping up with climate disaster trends. So we know that climate-related natural disasters are increasing in both frequency and severity, and costs are also increasing, disaster costs. And fifth, insurance sector profiteering. When we interviewed people, even people with insurance, who lived in high bushfire risk areas, some of them talked about the idea that insurers, there's a profit-driven sector, so the idea that, of course, they're not going to pay up in full following a disaster because they're hoping to skim back some of the money. Now, as far as we're aware, a lot of these had never been adequately researched or verified. There are figures on the issue of affordability, so there's validity there. But one thing that struck us as we were developing up this research program was that there's a lot of assumptions in here about households. So what I want to do this afternoon is burst some myths around some of these assumptions and possible explanations for underinsurance. So in terms of how we did the research, how we got the data that I'll present, I've already mentioned we did a national survey of Australian households to ascertain whether they had house and or contents insurance, and we were able to match that with socio-demographic data to find out who was potentially underinsured. And we've also been able to map underinsurance levels basically at the level of suburb for all urban areas in Australia based on their survey data, and I'll present some of these shortly. We're also collected data on insurance decision making before disaster, recognising insurance doesn't just matter after a disaster. We need to know how people are making decisions before something potentially happens. So we've done in-depth interviews with tree changers in Tasmania, and we're about to go to Victoria and do in-depth interviews with lower socioeconomic cohort on the outskirts of Melbourne. We're also interested in insurance experiences following disaster, and this component of the research was led by Christine Erickson from the University of Wollongong, which involved in-depth interviews with Blue Mountain residents. And also, yes, Chloe's research that she's leading of in-depth interviews with Hobart residents impacted by the May 2018 floods. We're also interested in this research with stakeholder and end user perceptions and input. So, bursting some myths. I've taken the first 3 of those possible explanations for underinsurance, and I'll unpack those a little bit. And we'll start with affordability. So we came up with a hypothesis as a basis for some quantitative analysis of survey data. My voice is getting better, isn't it? I feel really sorry for the people on the other end of the recording for this. So our hypothesis was that there would be a significant association between socio-economic disadvantage and underinsurance. So those living in financial hardship, with lower levels of education and potentially unemployed or in low-paid jobs were more likely to be underinsured. This seems like a logical hypothesis to test if affordability is a major driver of underinsurance. We also undertook qualitative analysis. This is the analysis of the in-depth interviews we did, or we're doing, with people that live in high bushfire risk areas. And we asked questions like, what shared themes emerge when talking with these households? Is affordability one of these shared themes? What other factors? What else contributes to underinsurance? What do we hear from people qualitatively? So here we go. This is a map of Hobart and Glenorchy municipalities. This was done by Dave Kendall, Dr. Dave Kendall in Geography and Spatial Sciences, one of our colleagues. So taking that survey data and actually mapping it onto urban Australia. So this map shows socioeconomic disadvantage. This is using Australian Bureau of Statistics data on disadvantage to map which communities, which suburbs have higher levels of disadvantage than others. The darker the colours, the higher the level of socioeconomic disadvantage. The lighter the colours, the lower the levels of disadvantage, or the higher the levels of advantage. So there's probably a difference there that I don't really need to explain. Hobart is more affluent, it's more middle class. Glenorchy has a working class industrial heritage. Its population is more low socioeconomic when compared to Hobart. So we get a really nice distinction there. Well, not nice necessarily for the people that live there, but we get a really clear distinction there between Hobart and Glenorchy. Is that making sense? So this is what happened when we translated this in relation to our underinsurance findings. That clear distinction between Hobart and Glenorchy disappears. So the darker areas are areas of higher rates or higher levels of underinsurance. This is people not having house and or contents insurance. And the lighter areas are areas that the residents are less likely to have house and contents and or are less likely not to have house and or contents insurance. So we get a much more complicated picture here, one that cannot alone be answered by the idea of affordability being a driver of underinsurance. So Dave crunched the numbers, my colleague crunched the numbers. We found 2 factors that were contributing to that distribution of underinsurance. These are statistically significant factors. Living without a spouse, so living alone. But the major driver was renting. And this caught our attention given current housing trends in urban Australia, not just in Hobart, but nationally. So to illustrate, we've got Claremont here, which is in Glenorchy, and South Hobart, Ferntree, with some of the demographic information there. The IRSD decile is the socio-economic disadvantage measure. So 2 is at the more disadvantaged end of the scale, 8 is at the more advantaged end. So it's basically from 1 to 10 there. So unsurprising, South Hobart, Ferntree, more advantaged than Claremont. In Claremont, we've got 4% of the population renting compared to South Hobart, Ferntree, which is 66%. We've got less university graduates compared to more university graduates. More people with incomes less than $650 per week than South Hobart, Ferntree, and more people employed in Ferntree. And we have associated levels of underinsurance. So here, this South Hobart, Ferntree area has a higher level of underinsurance than Claremont does. And that relates directly, is largely driven by the number of renters. So it raised another question for us. Do renters matter? Do we need to worry about them as we might worry about homeowners who are risking loss of property in a major housing asset?
Just get a clarification.
Yeah.
Did you get people to self-determine whether they were underinsured, or how did you determine that question?
Okay, the question was for your main place of residence. I'm talking a little bit off the top of my head here. Do you have, this is for homeowners, and then we ran through the list. Do you have contents insurance, house and contents insurance, or none? Yeah, and then for renters it was a separate question, because renters don't have house insurance because that's the landlord's responsibility to insure their assets. So we're just asking them, do you have contents insurance or not?
But just a yes or no rather than the value of that insurance.
Yeah, no, we weren't going, because we can't, it's a tricky thing to measure, because you don't know.
That's why I was curious. It's like you often don't know that until after the fact.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. No, that's a good clarification. So this is about people that do or do not have insurance, not that they have insurance and it wouldn't adequately cover them. Yeah. That's a much more complex thing to dig into. Yeah. So do renters matter? I guess historically there are assumptions about renters, that renting is a temporary form of accommodation. It's something you kind of move through quickly, perhaps in your younger years when you don't have many assets. So there's a low risk of asset loss. You're not going to lose, your main asset of a house. You might lose some contents. But if you're just starting out in life, if you're 21 years old, you might have utensils from an op shop, hand-me-down couch from mum and dad's. These are the kinds of assumptions we might have had about renters. And in the past, it's looked like quite a small cohort of people. But the Australian rental sector has grown by 38% in the last 10 years. 2.1 million households are now renting, and renting is becoming a new norm. This is contributed to significantly by the housing affordability crisis. So people cannot necessarily afford to move into their own place, to buy their own place. So renting is the option there. Now we found that 41% of renters in Australia do not have adequate insurance, as in contents insurance. They don't have contents insurance. But contents insurance in and of itself doesn't cover everything that might happen to you if your place of residence is impacted by a natural disaster. So I'll run through some examples of what happens to people. These are quotes Chloe did these interviews with flood-impacted residents. Yeah, go for it.
So this was a young man who lost his, was very surprised that when the flood hit, that he wasn't looked after by his rental agency. He said, we were wondering about temporary accommodation, whether they would put us up until we found a new place to live. And they said that was under contents insurance, which was our responsibility, and the house insurance just covered the house. So they were kicked out the same day that the flood happened. And they were unable to find a new rental, and so there were 5 people in the house, and they couch surfed basically in different places for 6 weeks. And he found it very stressful, and they all didn't know where they were going to go. And the group who hoped to stay together and continue to have a shared house over the coming couple of years actually fell out over all of this and ended up split between lots of different houses. So it had a big impact on their lives in general.
Yeah. So tenants can face eviction, homelessness, or living in damaged and deteriorating properties. Another quote here.
So this was a renter who did have contents insurance, but her contents were not damaged, but that she had nowhere else to live, and the rental agency or the homeowner would not give her any compensation to move out, so she kind of was stuck there with her family. She said, we were trying to keep communication going, like taking photos of things as they deteriorate. This massive fungus grew from the wall, and we were like, here's what's happening in the bathroom, and they didn't get any response back. So they were trying to communicate through the rental agency, but they had insurers coming in and out, and they weren't told who those people were, or getting any information from those assessors themselves, because those assessors were employed by the homeowner, or had a contract with the homeowner, not with the tenants. So they were left out of the loop, I guess.
Yeah. So an important part of the context of this is tenancy laws. Tenancy laws in Australia vary from state to state. Tasmania has some of the worst tenancy laws, and our reading of it is that there's no provisions there for natural disasters. So if this person, if the building became uninhabitable and was forced to move out, legally this person is obliged to continue paying rent under the existing tenancy laws in Tasmania. So tenancy laws are way behind the 8 ball in terms of natural disaster impacts and this big growth in the cohort of renters in Australia. Other states do better on this. Another element to help make sense of this in terms of it, the idea that temporary accommodation is under contents insurance. My preliminary look at contents insurance policies is that they just cover contents and not temporary accommodation, and it's only some contents insurance policies where temporary accommodation is an opt-in that you pay extra for. Did anyone know that with contents insurance?
I wouldn't have assumed it was covered.
Yeah, but that it could be covered if you went hunting, perhaps. Yeah. Yeah. So we're potentially looking at this is hypothetical, but if an area of one of Australia's cities that's got a really high rental population gets hit by a major disaster event, then there's going to be a load of people either homeless or living in deteriorating, damaged properties simply because they're renters. Different, related but different issues to homeowners. So, we've established it's more complex than affordability. So myth number 2, that people with inadequate or no insurance are irrational and foolish individuals. I mean, I've had those types of conversations with people. You know, someone that lives up in Ferntree, surrounded by bush, and they've said, I don't have house insurance because I don't like the insurance sector. And in the back of my head I've gone, oh my God, this person is crazy. So there's a lot of social norms about the importance of having insurance. But as we've covered, there are legal factors like inadequate tenancy laws that play into underinsurance. There are social factors such as changes in the housing market. So people that were assumed to be low risk, like renters, are now emerging as a potentially risky, vulnerable cohort of people. There's also insurance factors, such as the availability of temporary accommodation opt-ins tied to contents insurance, which, as far as I can tell, is only available sometimes by some companies. So myth number 3, a lack of information. So one of the key things we've found is that insurance decision-making takes place within a complexity and within the competing demands of everyday life. So information on risk is only part of the decision-making process. In our day-to-day lives, we're always making numerous decisions about all different kinds of things, and we can't be thinking all the time about that vague, abstract possibility of a bushfire or a flood that might occur once every 10 years or 50 years. There's also personal factors that play into why it's not just about a lack of information. So people are managing household budgets and they're making decisions about what matters more at particular moments in time. And they're also making calculations about the value of their house and contents in non-monetary terms. It's not all about the dollar figure that you can put on. So some of the people that we interviewed would say, well, there's no point insuring the couch because the couch was my grandmother's. It's irreplaceable. I've already also mentioned that the qualitative research, trust or lack of trust in insurance companies, was a major issue, and this fed into people either not taking out insurance at all or downgrading the level of coverage because they assumed the insurance companies wouldn't pay out in full anyway. So I'm going to finish with a couple of really long quotes.
Sandra?
Yes, these are from our interview participants. Sandra lives in Crabtree, around the back of Mount Wellington.
Well, I covered a house below the minimum level they suggested. And my reason for that was I felt perhaps they wouldn't pay out the full amount. And just in terms of affordability as well. The insurer usually does an often new kind of replacement on contents in the house. Like they would try and rebuild what you have. However, when I did read the documents, they said that sometimes they did a cash payout to allow you to rebuild. And one of the queries I had was, do we have to rebuild a weatherboard house? And they didn't really have an answer, the direct answer for that. And they said, oh no, we usually want to rebuild it as it is. I thought, well, that doesn't really make any sense. But then she rang Superior and that said, oh no, they can change it. But you have to pay an extra between the cost of what weatherboards would have been and the thing that you choose is. But because this house is very small and only low value, I guess I'm hoping that they would just give us a cash payout and be done with it. And then that would allow us to build something less fire-prone with the money.
So one of the reasons that Sandra gives for taking out insurance in the first place was the expectations of her family. So she said she couldn't look her mother in the eye if she didn't have the house covered. So there is also in Sandra's story evidence of the trade-offs concerning affordability and level of coverage, which also affects understandings of replaceability. So Sandra described, this is another quote that her contents is insured for $20,000, but my partner does film work and we've got specific film cameras. We've got a lot of irreplaceable stuff here. He's got footage that is irreplaceable and a lot of equipment of value. And even with cars and everything, the value is going to be far more than that. But I just hope that we'd have like a small kitty that would be like $20,000. I figure that would be enough to replace just the essential items. So Sandra also describes 2 other trade-offs she made when purchasing insurance. She lowered her house coverage as it was cheaper for her to purchase $20,000 worth of contents coverage than the same amount of house coverage. She felt that this trade-off was important as it allows her to have at least some contents insurance. Just to feel like I'm not going to be left with a bare house and nothing. So I think Sandra nicely illustrates some of the complexities involved in decision making at a household level when people are trying to decide how much insurance and what types of insurance.
It also came out in Miriam's work that was done in Christine Erickson and Eliza and Wollongong, that people were using their contents insurance to pay for upgrades to their house after their house burnt down. And so a lot of people juggled those things after the fact as well, because everybody pretty much was underinsured.
Yeah. Another interesting finding from the Blue Mountains, and I can't remember the details of it, it's in the process of being written up, is that even people that have been impacted by a total loss of property from the fires were still making decisions about house and contents insurance in this very complex context of everyday life. So there was one person that hadn't got around to taking an insurance policy out, I think.
Yeah, and people who were making decisions to be underinsured, having lost their house and having had to rebuild their house, they were then taking out policies that they remained underinsured. So there's a different sort of understanding of the adequacy of that insurance in everyday life to what there is, I guess, in the insurance industry.
So another quote here from a couple that were interviewed, and RACT gets a mention.
To be honest, I haven't really read the policy, but it's RACT and it's comprehensive, and I guess you trust that. So we said, do you feel any differently towards the RACT to other insurers? They said, yeah, probably just trust them more because, and Adam popped in, they're Tassie-based, and they said, yeah, they're a big company, they're Tassie-based, and we give them over $1,000 every year. They've got a big building. They've got a big building, and they give you a discounted news and discounted fuel. Yeah, a discount for K&D. So I guess that all builds trust in them.
So we find this narrative really interesting because I've already said that we've found that trust or distrust in insurance companies looks like it's a contributor to underinsurance. But we're also finding the way people's story, why they trust their insurance companies, to be incredibly insightful. Also potentially explains some of the advertising that insurance companies do. So,
particularly for RACT with the interviews I did around the floods, people said that because you were Tassie-based, the RACT was Tassie-based, that particularly did build trust. That's one of the reasons that people really talked about continuing to insure the RACT.
Yeah. And I should mention, this couple were tertiary educated, middle class, building a flash, high-tech, fire-resistant home up on the slopes of Mount Wellington. So we're not talking about people who are not savvy about marketing and branding and trust. Okay, so I started the presentation with a question, what to do about underinsurance. For me, this isn't there's no straightforward answer here. The answer you often get is we need to get people thinking more about their insurance policies and buying more insurance. But I hope one of the things I've done this afternoon is to point out that it's not just about buying more insurance. There are a whole load of other factors, legal factors, social factors, personal factors that play, insurance factors that play into insurance decision making. And some of the figures and stories we hear post-disaster, it's really hard to know how much insurance you actually need until after an event has happened. So just some loose suggestions here, and then we can open it up and hear other people's thoughts. I think we need to take the emphasis on what households should be doing. So this is a big emphasis in disaster management, in the literatures on disaster management. Households need to do this. They should be doing this. We need to provide more information. We need to educate people so they behave in a proper, kind of disciplined, well-behaved, rational way. I think that will work for some people some of the time. But if that's the only approach, or the dominant approach, it's not going to help people. It's not going to aid people in their recovery post-disaster when they discover that, they can build a 2-bedroom house instead of a 3-bedroom house because of the amount of insurance coverage they have. I think it's really important not to judge people who either choose not to have insurance or who are underinsured. It's too complex an issue to do that kind of moral policing on people, particularly after a disaster. Fair bit of scapegoating happens after natural disaster events, and sometimes it's the non-insured and the underinsured that are on the receiving end of a bit of that. So I don't think that's a useful stance to take. We need to rethink the idea of what is adequate insurance, and Chloe might want to speak a bit more to that.
So something that really came out of the work that they did in the Blue Mountains, that people were thinking about insurance not as they weren't expecting it in the end to be able to rebuild exactly what they had in exactly the right place. They were thinking, how can this get me the next step to where I need to be? And some people wanted to move. People had very different contexts about what they wanted to do and how they wanted to do it. But they were thinking about what was adequate for them to help them to take that next step. And that means something different for everybody, I think. So just saying you're underinsured, and it's very hard to know when you're underinsured because are you using your house value if you were to resell your house, or are you building in all of those understandings of what it would cost for getting someone else to rebuild it, or what it would cost if you did some of it yourself. There's all these different complexities in everybody's situation, and so everybody's going to be underinsured, but I think the important thing is this adequate for you and for your situation? And that was something that really started to come out of those interviews in the mountains where people had lost everything, but most of them had positive feelings about their insurance experience because it was adequate even though they were underinsured. It was adequate to get them on that next step. That's just a kind of reframing, I suppose, of how we think about what is underinsurance and what is adequate insurance.
Yep. And finally, I think we need to address structural issues as well as issues just to do with insurance. So we need to be looking at changes in urban environments and housing and how that may be contributing. We need to look at tenancy laws, for example, as well as some accountability and transparency issues to do with the insurance sector itself, because there's a lot of things that Chloe's uncovered in her interviews that the general public just don't know they can ask their insurance company for following a disaster. They're basically working in the dark and having to trust insurers to tell them, and insurers don't necessarily do that. Okay, thank you. Do you have any questions?
I've got two, but I'll only ask one at the moment. And it's sort of a reaction to your comment, actually. I'm trying to think of what the question is. I agree that it's not helpful to judge. My question, I suppose, is a bit of a yes but to that, which is as between when making decisions about how to allocate scarce public resources in the wake of a fire, some of that judgment about insurance or underinsurance is implicit. How would you respond to that? I suppose it's not so much a question of whether we judge them, but how do we, leaving that aside, how do we treat people who have, for whatever reason, chosen to either not insure or underinsure, as against those who have insurance? And what does that do in terms of incentivising behavioural choices about where to live and how to live?
So, an issue of equity, perhaps, in that if someone...
Yeah, I guess there is a sort of a broader equity issue, as between two landowners or residents, but also as between the victims of bushfire and the public who will support them in some way in terms of relief arrangements. So there's multi-dimensional equity issues there.
Yeah. The non-insured people that we've interviewed, people who deliberately chose not to have insurance, largely for political reasons, demonstrated a really high level of what we read as self-sufficiency. So, and that's how they talked about getting back on their feet. So there wasn't this, we didn't come across that implicit assumption that she'll be right, mate, you know, the government will give us some money. So I guess that's one side of it. The other side of it for me is that bouncing back after a natural disaster it's a community and a society bouncing back. So we have an obligation as a community and society to take everyone with us, no matter who they are, how we perceive them to be, or the decisions they've made. Now, in the modern context, this is turning into a bit of a daggy set of aspirations on my behalf. I start to sound like some old-fashioned kind of socialist, but one of the major anxieties expressed by people we interviewed in high bushfire risks areas, they actually said things like, no worries, the bush will bounce back. I will bounce back. But what about my community and suburb? Like, that was a major anxiety, that they'd find themselves living in some kind of ghetto, underworld, you know, burnt out wrecks of buildings and hoons spinning around looking for bits and pieces of leftover property to steal. So I think, from my perspective, we need to think about recovery and bouncing back as a societal event, not as a collection of individuals that should or shouldn't have done specific things. Yeah.
Can I answer that?
Yeah.
So I've been reviewing literature around climate change adaptation and home and context assurance. I've got 180 papers on my database, so this is a preliminary analysis that I've done. So there is often a worry that if you provide government aid, that it's a kind of a charity hazard, that you'll reduce people's likelihood to take out enough insurance, and there is some evidence of that. But there, on the other hand, where there isn't so much government assistance, there's also a case that where people are taking out insurance. People who are living in high-risk areas, particularly coastal areas, tend to be richer people who are actually subsidised by people in lower-risk areas and poorer people. There tend to be high-income people in high-risk areas who are being paid out through the insurance mechanism. So I don't think that just privatising it and having everything insurance is necessarily a better model than providing government assistance. I mean, there's a case for doing the opposite, for cutting out insurance and just providing government assistance on a sort of more even keel, I suppose.
Increase taxes. That'd go down well, wouldn't it? Okay.
But I think currently neither model quite works.
What did you learn about people's understanding of risk and risk management? Do people feel that insurance premiums reflect the actual risk they experience or that they're under from question related to that, do people see activities like prescribed burning or the Hobart Council developing fire breaks? Do they see a link between that and, I guess, the risk and the insurance they pay?
That's a really interesting question. One of the fascinating things about doing social science qualitative research is you can go in as a researcher with these ideas. We're going to research risk, or we're going to research climate change adaptation, perhaps. You start talking to people at a household level, and they're not using the same frames of reference. So the interviews we did with the tree changes, people would talk about bushfires and what they might do as a family or as a household, but they weren't framing it or using the language of risk. So risk hasn't emerged in our research as a key theme from a householder perspective. Obviously it's a very important preoccupation for land managers and emergency services. Sorry, there was another part to your question that
I guess I was thinking, do people see the activity in terms of prescribed burning or council fire breaks? Do they think, oh, okay, the Hobart City Council is clearing a big fire break behind my property, maybe my insurance premiums will go down because I have that? Do they think that sort of thing is taken into account in how the insurance companies work?
So, some people did, but that assumption when they asked their insurance companies about lowering premiums because of water tax, meeting building codes, burn-offs, land clearance, the insurance companies, and what we've heard, this is from interviews, this is not a systematic review, insurance companies were not lowering premiums on that basis.
I think there's a lot of potential for insurance companies to do more to help incentivise mitigation. There's a lot of research that shows that would be really well received and really helpful. We're also doing so with David Judgement, I'm working on a survey actually looking at how people factor in that, what the council are doing to their own preparations and their own understanding of how risky their area is. And there does seem to be a big gap between their own perception of their risk and a sort of scientific objective perception.
There's also a lot of my understanding, and I'm stepping a bit outside my knowledge base here, that premiums held by Australian insurance companies, like insurance companies all around the world, are set by reinsurers, which are these huge, massive global entities that aren't tapped into local specifics and issues. I don't know the maths or the science behind it, but there's huge, calculations and valuations going on at this global level by reinsurers, and that is fed down to companies like the RACT or Suncorp. So there isn't necessarily that local reflexivity or responsiveness of local insurance.
Comment on that. Which I think is interesting, which is like the trade-off of running a business which is reasonably complex financial service, is that insurers from a competitive point of view will really try and get as much information, like whether there's been clearings or distance to bushland and how it's being managed. What they typically won't do because of the complexity is give discretion to their sales staff to say, absolutely, I'll give you a discount. Like that discount will be baked into the premium. And you'd never then have an algorithm for telling the sales staff you have to explain that back to customers. So that's a really difficult marketing trade-off about it might already be there, but your sales staff is not going to be able to articulate that well to you as a customer, and won't be able to give you another discount on top of that. So that's kind of an interesting thing of how do you get the transparency for consumers to understand your basic premiums.
Yeah, that's really important because people see insurance as such a black box, that nobody knows what happens, how those calculations are made. And so you're operating on a kind of dependency that doesn't allow you to trust in that process.
Exactly.
You can't see what's going on.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So just going back to one of your original comments around the normalisation of insurance in Western cultures. So I guess, do we know anything about what led to that normalisation, especially when we look at the increase in renters in Australia? And is it due to certain life stage events? I don't know, for example, if you think, when you're buying a home and you have to go to a bank to get a loan, there's probably a trigger there. You might have to have a certificate of insurance currency to deliver that? And what are those social normalisation factors that have led for homeowners to have insurance but not renters? Because then it kind of, those recommendations, you go, maybe there's actually societal changes that are hard blocks to getting insurance.
That's a really good question, and I don't have a simple answer to it. If anyone knows anyone that wants to do a PhD looking at the history, particularly of house and contents insurance and how it evolved and emerged within the Australian context, because, I mean, I can think of anecdotes that I've read of insurance salespeople used to walk door to door selling insurance, and they'd do a evaluation not only of your property's risk, and it was primarily fire, but also of the moral character of the household. So if there was any sense that there was an alcoholic in the house, unemployed people, the dishes not washed, they were doing this calculation of risk. So, I mean, that might give some kind of clue in the moral shaming if you didn't get sold an insurance product because you were judged, perhaps. But I think that's only one thread in the story. Yeah.
I was very surprised to hear you just comment that the global reinsurance firms dictate very much at what level premiums are set, because I was under the impression that there was in fact a lot of data around frequency of, let's say, fire, or in Queensland, depending on your location, a hit from a cyclone, etc., which would determine premium levels, which is quite local stuff. So, for example, the Gold Coast and the canal developments, some insurance companies actually won't insure there because of the likelihood of an inundation. So, are you saying that the practice is not to take local? I mean, when I say local, it can be big data of a country
Yeah.
in an area.
Look, as I said, I'm talking about reinsurance. I'm stepping quite a bit out of my knowledge and expertise base, so it's just based on what I've read. But I have heard anecdotes too of people rebuilding after a fire and then not be able to get insurance again. So I don't know where that decision making comes from.
Well, I've heard the head of Munich Ray Australia present, and they had very detailed climate data, specifically around cyclone hits in Queensland, where the premiums were variable because of really detailed data collection, and they employ their own analysts, etc., to set that. So I wouldn't think that would be unique to Munich Ray, and I would have thought it would spread to others, maybe the insurance guys.
I think the only thing I'd say to that is that it's Munich Ray have good analysts, and they have like research teams.
Yeah.
But the reinsurance industry itself is one you're dealing in lots of dollars, so the sales guys selling that stuff, they have like Asia Pac as a region, so they're selling across like a quarter of the globe, and so they're not particularly interested in Tasmania as a thing. They'll look at an insurance portfolio and go, we reckon you've got your risk balance about right, but their overall rates will be pretty fixed, and it's very much a sales brokerage thing where you're trying to access large volumes of money. So typically it doesn't get down to that detailed level of analysis that you might expect. They'll have it to assess an insurance company to make sure they think they're doing as good as they can, but they won't impact premiums in a granular way. They'll